Welcome again to the session on Sohrab and Rustum by Matthew Arnold. We have analyzed the poem line by line and also had a long discussion on the story of and the plot of Sohrab and Rustum as borrowed from Firdausi Shahnama. We know that it is a story based on a historical event that took place in Persia. Matthew Arnold has acknowledged its source to be Sir John Malcolm's History of Persia and states in the preface to the poem itself by quoting that he treats a noble action in a somewhat epic fashion. And in preparing to compose the consciously Homeric poem in the style of an epic, Arnold was very fond of Homer and he read Homer with great admiration, and he expresses in his poems like To a Friend on translating Homer and the study of poetry and acknowledges his admiration and love for Homer. When we read the poem, we know that this is an epic poem. Now, what do we mean by epic is since it is based on a Homeric model and Arnold's elevated tone, his ornate language, his use of extended similes, and the imposing stature he gives to his two main figures, that is Sohrab and Rustum, and the use of overriding fate working out their destiny, and also the creation of a central dramatic episode of national significance makes this poem an epic. As an epic poem, Sohrab and Rustum is admired for its moving presentation of a dramatic conflict between father and son, its brilliant use of language, and its richness of tone. When we look at the classical fashion, the poem involves one central action which takes place in a day, and many critics have commended on the success of the poem's many epic similes and other parallels that have been used by Arnold in the poem. The main critical interest of the poem lies in its allegorical presentation of the moral and intellectual conflict, which is very typical of the Victorian age, and its dramatization of personal dilemmas. We can say that the battlefield that Arnold chooses for this poem is the poetic landscape, and we borrow a phrase from Dover Beach where he calls it the darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. So, this kind of an image that he has created in the Dover Beach is repeated again, where father and son are ignorant of their identities and they clash by the night. The characters, Sohrab and Rustum, they are seen as personifications of the warring elements within the hearts and minds of all Victorian writers, we can say. And Arthur Hugh Clough, who was Arnold's close friend, he praises the poem and he was a rival for the admiration of his father because he died in 1842. This single combat, which has been depicted in the poem between the venerable father Rustum and his son, has personal parallels in the conflict between Matthew Arnold and his father, Dr. Thomas Arnold. This is the personal life of Matthew Arnold. His father was a headmaster of rugby school, and he was known for instilling moral earnestness and devotion to duty among his pupils. So, in many ways, we can see that Thomas Arnold he resembled the proud, invincible old warrior Rustum, and the biographers who have written Arnold's biography, they have suggested that in a sense, Arnold is like Sohrab, who was engaged in the archetypal search for his father. And from early boyhood, we see that Arnold was both attracted to and repelled by his father's rigorous dedication to educational reforms. And as Arnold matured from the youthful poet into the mature prose writer, he took on the stoic nature and moral vigor of his father. The poet W.H. Auden, as has been suggested, that the voice of Thomas Arnold, he kills the poet in the son Arnold just as Rustum kills Sohrab in the poem. We also see that Arnold's rebellion against his father began during his school days at rugby, and it was manifested for many years in a deliberately flamboyant lifestyle. While Arnold consciously played the part of a typical dandy, appearing as a carefree, in one of his poems, he refers to this also. The poem is Strayed Reveller. He wishes to be romantic poetry, portrayed as a lonely and divided soul who yearns for peace and unity. Now, this is very clear that, in part, the poet always wanted to embody the virtues he has ascribed to his father in his tribute to him in the poem Rugby Chapel, also, which is another poem by Arnold, in which he describes him as one of the souls tempered with fire, fervent, heroic, and good. Now, in the prose writings also, Arnold deliberately embodies his father's admirable traits and poetic self dies, as if he was in his father's arms. Now, this in this poem, the death of Sohrab, the conflict is to a certain extent resolved, but not without Rustam having to endure the deep grief and the lasting sorrow that is being depicted in the poem. Even more specifically, if we discuss this, that the battle between Sohrab and Rustam, it embodies two aspects of Arnold's internal personal struggle during the years 1850s and 60s, when we see that his poetic self was challenged, his prosaic self to single combat. Now, this combat ended with the emergence of a sadder and a wiser prosaic self. Arnold, who began his transition from rebellious poet to a social reformer in the year 1851, we see that he was appointed on the position of an inspector of schools. Now, this position was held by Arnold for 35 years, and in June, when he married down and settled, he wrote during the last 30 years of his life, he virtually willed his poetic self to death. He replaced the writing of poetry with literary and social criticism and various kinds of religious and educational prose works. Now, when we are reading the poem Sohrab and Rustam as an allegory of some personal conflict, it is very instructive to consider that the similar story told by William Butler Yeats in his drama on Bailey's Stand, in which he chooses a venerable old father character who symbolizes Irish nationalism and kills the young stranger who is his son. W.B. Yeats uses the single combat between the father and the son to define heroic identity in terms of warring halves of the soul. Now, in one interpretation of this poem, we see that Arnold has mentioned the river Oxus, which is the chief river of Central Asia, and this river is symbolic or interpreted as an emblem of human destiny because that runs through the desert, wasting its energy in frustration, but at last reaching its tranquil goal in the starlit sea. So, at the beginning of the poem, we see that the river Oxus is obscured by the fog in the grey dawn, just as the course of Arnold's life was obscured. And as the poem ends, we see that stars are emerging to shine on the tranquil waters of the united self of mature Arnold. We summarize this section on the poem as an epic. We see that there are long formal speeches which occur in the midst of the action. We see that the principals employ a courtly manner of address. The poet hastes into the midst of action, employing the media's reopenings. He is frequently employing extended similes. The climax also involves the confrontation of mighty opposites. The hero exemplifies a life of physical action. The epic hero, he finally carries finely crafted weapons who are massive and no one else can wield them. A sense of doom, destiny, or fate surrounding also battles the heroic adversaries, which is often going to determine some kind of a national issue. And in the process of dying, the defeated warrior pronounces upon the fate of the victor. The victor is achieving an epiphany, a super rational understanding of the nature of human existence. Now, these are the 10 separate components which we can find in the poems Rustam and Sohrab. And we can see that these are the points which make this poem an epic poem. It's a narrative borrowed from some kind of a myth or a history, but the style in which it is written, this makes the poem an epic poem in all its grandeur and manifestation. Thank you.